all across space. All across time. Mysteries that we can't understand.
Dude, this is a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
Looking into the stories and those behind them. Welcome to UAP Insight Podcast. Hey everybody, awesome show today. We have Dan Zetterström from That UFO Podcast. Ancient Aliens, made a UFO documentary in South America, just came out a couple of years ago, and that's actually how he met his wife, was through that. And he guest starred in Ancient Aliens, and he has a new podcast coming out called What It Means to Be Human. So without any further ado, welcome to the Insight, Dan.
Thanks so much for having me, man. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of tell me a little bit about yourself. How'd you get into the UFO UAP topic?
So, I mean, for as long as I can remember, I've been interested. The first kind of memory I have of kind of weirdness is the first house I lived in, with my parents when I was a kid, around like 4 or 5. My sister had this book on the mysteries of the world, and it had like the pyramids, UFOs, the Nostradamus kind of prophecies and stuff like that in it. And she was scared of it, so she kind of threw it out of her room one day, and I picked it up, and it got me hooked. And then I think a few weeks later, I was channel surfing and came across the premiere of the season 2 of the X-Files, and I watched that, and I was all in. And there was some kind of weird things that went on in that house that my family can attest to. Just moments where like I got a pencil thrown at me when I was in a room on my own. Various things like that. My dog greeting people in the middle of the room that weren't there. Jumping up and down, tail wagging, that kind of stuff. So I've kind of been around high strangeness all my life, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I can kind of commiserate with that. So the house that I grew up in, which is about 40 miles from where I'm at. I'm not sure what that is in kilometers, but
you can go miles.
So I was working on a car with my dad at the time, and we were just putting stuff away. He's on the other side of the garage. There's a shelf behind me with some parts on it, and there was a fuel pump that was about yay big. So probably, I want to say about 10 inches tall or so, sitting on a shelf just like behind my knee. And it flew up, hit me in the back of the head, cut the back of my head open a little bit, and left a lump, and just an overwhelming like force of like just malevolence almost kind of overwhelmed me at the time. There's no way it could have been my dad, because he was, about 5 meters in front of me, or about 30 feet or so. And that was just kind of a first-hand experience with poltergeist activity.
How strange, man. It really knows how to get your attention, huh?
Yeah, and what's really weird about that is I think it was about 12 hours prior to that, 12 to 15 hours. I had been driving between the town I was living in and Spokane, Washington. And I was actually forced off of the road by a military convoy with something on a flatbed trailer that was like rocking back and forth, just very slightly covered in a black tarp. And I mean, I had like kind of almost as though like what Jake Barber has been describing in all of his appearances, where it was like a unreal type of connection with whatever was there. So I may have witnessed the process of a retrieval, or at least a transfer of retrieved products.
That's crazy, man. Like, I don't think people realize how big the US is to kind of do things like this. You know, when you say about transferring materials between bases, people kind of go, at least outside the US at least, they kind of go, you know, how could you hide something like that? Yada, yada. And when I had the pleasure of going across the US, you know, road tripping coast to coast, you really get an idea of just how much open space there is and how easy it would be to hide things. You know, in the UK, I'd say the most you could drive without seeing anybody else would probably be about a half hour, unless you're in, you know, the arse end of Scotland, you know, right up north in the islands. But in the US, you know, there were, as we were hitting the West Coast, there were sections where we drive for like 8 hours and not see a single soul. And it was just desert as far as the eye could see. And it blew my mind. You know, I recognize not everyone can kind of make a trip like that, but seeing that and experiencing that emptiness and that vastness really kind of opened my eyes to how easy it would be to hide things and to move things around.
Yeah, it's just the amount of time. I mean, I see posts on like Facebook all the time where, and you have like English person saying, "Oh, I'm not going to go see my family today." American person is like, "Well, how far away are they?" "Oh, it's about 45 minutes up the A10."
It's about right.
You know, then the American person is like, "Well, I drive 3 hours a day just to get to work." You know, and especially in rural America, just the amount of distances just to get to like your local like supermarket can, you know, range anywhere from, you know, 10 minutes to an hour and a half. And, you know, without any kind of, you know, at that point you're just like, well, an hour and a half isn't that far relatively.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I lived in Vermont with my fiance for a bit. And well, I shouldn't say live. I was there for 3 months, so I was visiting, but you know, spent a big chunk of time there. And we were up near the Canadian border. And yeah, I think it was like 45, 50 minutes to the nearest store. And they regularly had power cuts and stuff. And it was an education for me, you know. And then back in the UK, I had to drive to London recently, and it's 3 hours. And that's basically one side of the country to the other. Whereas in America, that doesn't get you very far, you know?
Yeah, it takes me, I would say, 3 hours to get from my house to the largest city in Northeast Washington. And I mean, that's so just for scale, I mean, that's only about 100 miles or so.
Sure.
So I mean, that's just, the US is just massive. So who knows what can be hiding, whether it be out in, you know, places like Nevada or Arizona, or clear up into like the more heavily forested areas where it's almost easier, I would say, to hide things because you have all of the tree cover and you know, mountainous terrain that just, you know, all the stuff that's been carved by glaciers over centuries and millennia.
Yeah, man. And that kind of terrain, you know, again, people here, they'll go for a walk and they're like, oh yeah, I'm walking 3 hours, and you're never really in any danger in the UK when you kind of do that. You know, you just kind of don't plan it and you just go. Whereas when I was in the US, it was when the heat wave was hitting in 2023, and we were in Death Valley, you know, around that time, and it was crazy hot. And almost every single day you'd have reports of people going on hikes and they wouldn't take enough water with them, and they were found dead, you know, the next day. And it's really vast. And that's kind of an aspect of when you relate that kind of vastness to the Earth and the amount of areas we just don't really know about, especially when we're talking about under the oceans and stuff like that. It's that kind of space that tickled my fancy in terms of the paranormal, and what could be out there that we just don't know. People think we have everything figured out, and we really don't. We're finding new species every year, digging up, pre kind of modern human hominids. They found a new species in the Sahara Desert that they've released the papers on yesterday, I think it was, and there's more coming out. And this is just like another human kind of precursor that we didn't know about. And yeah, we get so used to kind of thinking that everything in our society and world is known, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, no, that's crazy. Because I mean, the last I heard, the newest one was Homo naledi, and I forget exactly where that was, but I mean,
That
I haven't
was the Rising Star Cave in Africa, and it was actually really funny. I was in London not long back to film for Ancient Aliens, and I was just in a random pub in London, and I'm sat there with my fiance, and this guy walks in, and I look at her, I'm like, oh my god, is that Lee Berger? And she was like, who? And I was like, the guy that found Homo naledi, like Dr. Lee Berger. Is that Lee Berger? And he had like a National Geographic jacket on, so I was like, surely. And she was like, you're such a nerd, just go say hi. So I went and say hi, and it was him, and we had like an amazing chat about Homo naledi and peer review and everything that's come from that and the implications of that discovery. And I always, if you listen to that UFO podcast, I'll bring Homo naledi up often because it's a really good example where it just blew apart some of the assumptions we have that big brain means smarter, that we were the first to use fire, that we were the first to kind of bury and remember, and make memorials and stuff. And Homo naledi kind of has us beat by tens of thousands of years. And it begs the question, was there another species that kind of did that? And what would they look like if there was a small group of them still here? And they developed technology and kind of could bounce off ours, when it comes to the UFO stuff. And the idea of like another species sharing this planet with us, it all fits really nicely together, it feels almost too easy.
Yeah, well, I mean, Occam's razor is the simplest answer, but I mean, that's kind of a oversimplification there. But I truly think that another species seems too easy, but at the same time, it's so easy because it might actually be true.
Yeah, exactly. If you've ever been traveling to see any of the ancient megaliths, I went to Mexico and spent like 3 months kind of traveling and just seeing all of these Mayan ruins, and the difference between ones that were just essentially just marks on the ground and the full-blown pyramids like people imagine when they think of Mexican kind of ruins like Chichen Itza. It was just a couple of 100 years. And again, it really drilled into me how easy it would be for all of kind of like a pre-civilization to be subsumed, but as the the tectonic plates move around and the planet kind of renews itself, there wouldn't be much of a trace left at all, especially when you kind of take into account meteor strikes and just natural phenomena like that. I think it was in Syria, they found a village where it'd been hit by a meteor, and the temperatures was so hot that the researchers there basically, the example they used to explain it was that if there was a modern car as we know them, kind of where the meteor hit, it would have been melted to a puddle and disappeared without a trace within like a millisecond of this impact. So it really makes you think. And I know that we've got to kind of dig up the evidence and find the evidence before we kind of, make our hypothesis and test it and so on and so forth. But there's definitely room for other civilizations that came before us.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do you think the most likely space for a former civilization would be? Would it be like somewhere, in the middle of like the Sahara Desert where it's buried underneath the sand, or down in like Antarctica, for example, or over, hidden in South America, or Where exactly do you think it would be the best candidate?
That's a really good question, and I probably wouldn't be able to pick a place just because I don't know the climates, and I know that it has to be warm enough for kind of things like agriculture and growing food and stuff like that. But then I try and remember as well that life just kind of finds a way, and we see civilizations flourishing in so many places that we didn't expect to find them. Be it thick jungles or ice packs or whatever. There are tribes of people where they swim underwater for 5 minutes to catch fish. I can't hold my breath for like a minute. So that's mind blowing. That's like a superhuman trait to me, but it's just in their gene pool how they develop. But definitely from kind of cursory, I say research, but just reading research that other people have put out, scientific papers and stuff. It would be looking kind of underground. In Turkey, they have those kind of underground caverns that's almost like a city carved out. And it kind of begs the question, was there a cataclysm on the surface where whatever civilization was there had to move underground to survive? And we find this kind of pattern all over the world where groups went, they dug the tunnels, they kind of lived in mountains. In America especially, you can kind of see incredible ruins kind of carved into the side of actual mountains and houses and homes. It's mind-blowing. Like people just find a way to survive everywhere, and I think it's really short-sighted to kind of or now it's really short-sighted to kind of look at an environment and go, nothing could survive here. Everywhere we look we find life, whether it's the underneath of icebergs in the Arctic and things like that, or in volcanoes, or even in Chernobyl, inside the reactor. We found mushrooms that eat radiation, and it's just mind blowing. There just seems to be life everywhere.
Yeah, I think you make some really good points there, and I one thing that's always kind of fascinated me, like about like the Chernobyl incident, is just when the radiation increased after the disaster, the mutations that happened in all of the local flora and fauna were happening at such a rapid pace. It was a perfect case study to study evolution.
Yeah.
So the mushrooms or the fungi that turned into radiation eating before would have just been something that was probably edible, probably used for thousands of years up until that point. But now it has created a new purpose to help reduce the amount of radiation in the area, to help stabilize the earth. It's almost as though the earth itself is reacting to the adverse effect and trying to balance itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you look much into the work of Sarah Amara Walker, her name is, and she just released a book called Life as We Don't Know It. And her whole thing is that, when we look out into the universe with the James Webb Telescope and stuff like that, and we're looking for life, we don't actually have a definition of what we're looking for, beyond kind of two arms, two legs, and maybe some techno signatures like, an industrial civilization and smoke coming out of the chimneys and street lights and stuff. That's all really focused on us and like how we are. And there's no guarantee that other forms of life are going to be like that. Even when we look at this planet and we go back millions of years, you had like these giant mushroom structures that were taller than the Empire State Building that was the dominant life form on the planet. So we kind of need to take the shackles off. And she's kind of come up with a system where rather than looking to see like, oh, can it talk to me? Like, that's intelligent life. Her approach is to look at the evolution of something that they find. And there are markers in how many times something is kind of mutated and changed and adapted. And when it gets to a certain amount of steps, you can kind of see that it's coalescing into something more than just, a single-celled organism, for example. And so she's trying to kind of use that as a fingerprint when we look out into the cosmos to find other forms of life. Because this really fascinates me, especially if you look at, you mentioned it already with mushrooms. And I think it was it the Greeks or the Romans? I forget which. I always mix these two up, but they thought, that dogs and cats were dumb as rocks. That's the amount of awareness they had, and anyone that has a dog or a cat in their house knows that's not true. They're not just like rocks. They're not just inanimate objects. There's an internal life there, and they go and explore, and they communicate, and they kind of have their the radius they go around the homes and the areas, and they share those with others, and it's almost like a civilization unto itself. And then we went from kind of humans were the only kind of intelligent life form to now humans and animals have been given that they have an awareness and they have rights and so on and so forth. And then recently, I say recently, a couple of 100 years came in that, fungi was another one that kind of came in as a life form. And so we're kind of finding all of these pockets of really interesting expressions of different forms of life and tracing them back to where it all kind of links together and breaks off from kind of one common ancestor. And Sarah, in her work, kind of, she traces that kind of evolution back to kind of find that fingerprint of life. And she presents this diagram when she presents her work. And you can kind of see on one kind of side of the chart, it's, the complexity of life. And on the other side, it's the amount of time that's kind of passed. And so you end up with, life emerging over time in all of these different ways. And it almost looks on her graph like a squid, like a life form unto itself. And so I think people are starting to kind of at least ponder the question as to whether evolution itself could be a life form that's kind of trying to find ways to survive in environments. And if that's the case, it's not just going to be here on Earth. It's going to be everywhere in the cosmos. And things like meteors carrying bacteria from one planet to another is going to be a vehicle for this life to kind of spread and find new expressions. So we've gone from DNA to RNA to all these other wonderful ways of looking at life. And it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that train of thought gone. That's mind blown. You'll have to send me a link to that book.
Yeah, absolutely. She's got really good presentations on YouTube if people want to go look. But she's a proper scientist, and she's just putting her work out there for people to kind of start thinking about this. Because depending on what scientific discipline you're in, they all have different definitions of life. And by one discipline's definition, water is alive. You look at the ocean and it says, oh, well, that's alive because it's got all of these constituent parts. But by another discipline's definition, water is inert. It's not life. And so we really need to come to a consensus as to what even constitutes life. Does it need a body? Can it throw engine parts at you in the garage if it wants to? And then we kind of start getting into areas of kind of probably philosophy and religion and spiritualism where people talk about, afterlife, and if there's a part of us that kind of goes on after death, that's just energy, and if there could be life in energy. And that's for people smarter than I to get into, but it's really tantalizing. And you kind of wonder, if we got here from Greeks thinking that dogs were rocks to us and all of our wonderful ways of expression and recognizing life around us on this planet, what's it going to look like in 500 years? Like what kind of things are we going to look at and go, that's not an ecosystem. That ecosystem in itself is a life form.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's my personal belief that the ocean is alive because, I mean, just look at tidal surge. The ocean's breathing.
There've been many times I've been on the beach and I'll watch kind of the ocean, as the tide's coming in. It kind of almost looks like it's crawling up the beach towards you. And, I've stood there and pondered it and thought exactly the same thing, but who knows where it's going?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to kind of get into the topic of historical locations as they relate to UFO sightings. So landmarks such as like the cliffs at Dover, or like the Grand Canyon. What do you think would draw UFOs to a place like that?
So for me, in my work, going to Colombia and the research that I've done, kind of diving into this topic, the thing that seems to kind of pervade all UFO. So I won't say all, actually, because someone will kind of say, no, that's not true. Most of all is that, land can kind of, the shape of land and the way it's formed can influence the Earth's electromagnetic field and how that kind of, interacts with the planet. So, like up a mountain, you're going to have a different field reading to kind of at sea level and lower, and, vice versa. And so what I found, especially in Colombia, and it kind of blew my mind when we realized it, was that. Wait there, let me take a step back and just explain Colombia a second. So we went to Colombia to investigate. They were called the Dancing Lights of La Peña de Huayca. And they've been reported for thousands of years, go way back to when the Spanish conquistadors kind of went down there. And these lights on the mountain were always reported, and people had different names for them. Some people will call them like ancestor lights and things like that, whereas now people just kind of call them UFOs. And in common parlance, I guess, when you look at them, they would look like orbs based on people's descriptions. And everyone there had a story of these lights and seeing them, and craft that they'd seen. Even someone told us that there was a tic tac going around the mountain once. And so we went there to capture footage of this phenomena, which we ended up doing, which was incredible. And then to try and replicate it, to take away prosaic explanations. So we took like these super bright torches up the mountain to see if it was just people mucking about with torches and stuff like that. And it just didn't look anything like it at all. And to get up the mountain, you had to walk up a riverbed, essentially. There was no path up there. And then on top of that, the roads up to the mountain were lined with kind of houses where cartel members would live. So we had to have like a police escort up the mountain. So there's all these kind of circumstances that say like, yeah, it's pretty difficult for anyone to get up there with a bunch of equipment to fake a UFO sighting. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the actual lights appeared on a sheer cliff face. So whoever was there would have to have all this equipment, be abseiling down the cliff face of the mountain and shining these torches to kind of fool people into thinking that these UFO things were happening. And yeah, it was incredible to see the lights and to film them and stuff like that. But when I kind of dove into the electromagnetic data for the area, which people can do if they just kind of go on Google and search for EMAG V2, it just gives you an overlay from all the satellites that we kind of have in orbit now. And you can see the two peaks that the lights are said to travel between. One was in a negative electromagnetic anomaly, and the other one was in a positive one. And there was also a water source between the two, like an underground river. So you end up essentially with this giant battery, a positive end, a negative end, and a flow between the two. And so from that, I kind of started checking all of these other sightings. And it's true in other areas as well. Active areas in South Wales where people see UFOs all the time also seem to be in, really negative or really positive magnetic anomalies. And so I've kind of come to this place where I now associate these areas of interest that get a lot of UFO sightings or a lot of paranormal activity, like the Uinta Basin, where Skinwalker Ranch is, and Mount Shasta and stuff like that. They all have this trait. And so I've got to wonder, and I'm just kind of spitballing here because I don't have equipment out there kind of looking at this stuff, but just wondering if these kind of things act like beacons to any visitors kind of coming here, or if they act as, more malleable doorways, if it's like an ultra-dimensional thing kind of coming through portals, as we call them. But there's got to be something in that attracts these things there. Yeah. maybe they're windows we can see through. I really don't know, but there's definitely a correlation between landmarks, like the Grand Canyon, and electromagnetic anomalies and paranormal stuff going on in those locations.
Yeah, I know a lot of native tribes in the U.S. speak about landmarks that are specific to them, where they have seen things going back thousands, to some tribes even say tens of thousands of years. And one thing that is kind of a common denominator between all of them is there does seem to be some sort of electromagnetic, or sometimes even like weird things such as like gravity hills in those
Sure.
areas. And I mean, I think you're onto something with calling that connection out.
Yeah, it's interesting, and good job mentioning gravity as well, because again, in a lot of these locations, and again, this is open source data, so you can go get it and download Google Earth and overlay this stuff and check for yourself. But yeah, you can find gravity anomalies as well that line up with these areas. Catalina Island was the same, and that's where Dave Fravor and Alex Dietrich, both commanders and excellent pilots, famously encountered the Tic Tac UFO, and so yeah, like are these things like lighthouses in the dark to this phenomena, whatever it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I want to ask you is kind of what inspired you and Andy to start That UFO Podcast.
So that came about. It was really organic, actually, because neither of us were doing anything in the UFO subject before COVID happened. And then COVID happened. Everyone's got to stay indoors, and so you're twiddling your thumbs, wondering what to do. And the thing I did was like, well, okay, don't have to go to work, don't have to go out and earn money now. Like, just what do I want to do? I'm stuck indoors. I've got to read stuff or watch stuff and so on and so forth. So my thing was to just dive back into UFOs. And it was actually kind of somewhat synchronistic because, like I say, when I was a kid, big into UFOs and stuff like that. And then as I grew up, I kind of went away from it. And just to emphasize how bad it was when I was a kid, or how intense, I should say, all the kids in my school nicknamed me Spooky, because that was Mulder's nickname in the X-Files. And when we had show and tell, I would always bring like my X-Files cassettes in and just talk people's ears off about UFOs and everything like that. So yeah, I grew up and I kind of lose touch with that, but I went kind of heavy into academic things like physics, chemistry. And then I happened across Blink-182's music. And so that caused me to pick up the guitar. And then I kind of really embraced my creative side and went into like filmmaking. And I ended up doing work at like Pinewood and stuff like that. And then around, all through this, Tom DeLong, the guitarist, just for anyone listening who might not know these guys, he's talking about UFOs this whole time. It's not just the song Aliens Exist, just in a lot of interviews he do with fans or with news outlets, he talk about UFOs. So as he was traveling, he was interviewing abductees and experiences and stuff like that. And so that kind of kept my interest peaked. And but I never believed that in 2015 he would found the company to the stars and start pushing on the UFO angle really, really heavily. And then as that's happening, we get the New York Times thing. That article came out, and all of that kind of came at the perfect time for me to then be, nicely obsessed again as we all got locked in for COVID. And so I started a Twitter account because UFO Twitter was becoming a thing then. And it was really small. There were just a few of us that were just throwing back and forth ideas and different sources and outlets and stuff like that, interviews. And then I can't remember when it was, but kind of quite early on in that, Andy reached out to ask if I wanted to chat on his show, and he'd only done like 1 or 2 episodes by that point. So I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And we kind of became fast friends. We would call each other and just talk about this stuff, intensely for an hour. And we started off kind of doing like Skinwalker Ranch watch-alongs, but we found there was, it was fun, but that the episode structure of that show doesn't lend itself to just talking about what's going on screen, because there's a lot of repeating, there's a lot of silence, and that kind of stuff. So from there, we kind of thought, well, we have these big conversations about everything that's going on in UFO world between us. Like, why don't we just record these and put these out? Like, maybe people would be interested in that. And we kind of have fun with it. We joke about it and joke to each other and take the, as we say in the UK, take the mickey out of each other with it. And so we started recording them and putting them out. And it just, it just kind of blew up at some point. People like listening to it. They like the energy. They like the fact that we try and remain neutral. And Andy and I kind of both represent different ends of the spectrum. He's very nuts and bolts. I'm very into the woo and the science of the stuff. And yeah, so people liked it. We kept on doing it. And now here we are, like 4 years later.
Yeah, I've been listening to you guys since I believe spring of 2021.
Oh, you're an OG. Nice.
And I mean, it's just seeing the people that you guys have talked to, and just the growth that you've been able to achieve has just been really inspiring for me, and I'm sure several other people that are, in this space. And I just want to make sure that how appreciated your guys' work is, because I mean, there's just a lot that you bring to the table.
That's really kind of you to say, man. I always say to myself whenever I do something, if I can inspire one person to just think a little differently about things, then job done. And yeah, this has just been a riot in success. And I never dreamed there would be, like all these years growing up as an adult, trying to figure out what my career was going to be. And it turns out I should have just listened to 4-year-old me and just done the UFO thing this whole time. And yeah, as we've been going, you're right. We've been very fortunate to meet some really interesting people and to have them on the show. And from that, I've been able to, like I mentioned, I went across the US. While I was doing that, I got to talk at Roswell. I stayed with Lou Elizondo for a few days, and he took us to Devil's Tower, and that's actually where I proposed to my fiance. We also stayed out in Catalina. We met Sean Cahill. We met the granddaughter of someone who was at the Hopkinsville Goblin kind of encounter. Went to New York, met Leslie Kane. All these absolutely incredible people. And one of my favorite stand-up memories from that trip was sitting at a bench in kind of a little league baseball park with Commander Alex Dietrich, who encountered the Tic Tac, and just talking to her for like an hour or so, just face to face, on a really human level, about her feelings on the encounter and kind of how it impacted her day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. And oh, excuse me. What do you think has been kind of the most meaningful connection that you've made throughout the process of making the show?
I mean, it's got to be my fiance, and it's actually a really strange one as well, because I love her to bits, and we met through doing the UFO documentary. But everything that kind of led there for me was a process of kind of literally deciding that I was going to just burn my life down and throw everything over to whatever strange force is guiding all this weirdness in the universe, and saying like, okay, take me, let's see where this goes. And at the time I was filming a documentary in Boleskine House up in Scotland, which was where Aleister Crowley did the Aberrant Melon ritual. And it's a beautiful place. It's just on the edge of Loch Ness. And they're rebuilding it, so they wanted to do a documentary. So a few of us went up there to kind of, interview the owners, and there were a whole bunch of scholars there. And we had a great time. But the room where he did the ritual, obviously he's associated with dark magic, so people just think evil, evil, and run away. And for me, I found the place really serene and beautiful. So basically at midnight one night, I went to the house on my own and I sat in that room in pitch black and I meditated and I just said, like, this is me. Transform me, take me. This was the point of a kind of the ritual. Supposedly at the end of the ritual, you would meet your higher self and get advice from them. And that ritual goes about 18 months. And, I didn't have 18 months, but I said, I invited everything in and kind of just said, okay, I'm going to walk over the threshold now and I invite change. Let's let the weirdness kind of guide me. And I walked over the threshold and then everything pretty much that's happened to me in the last like 3 or 4 years leading to meeting my partner and now, getting my visa and being able to kind of emigrate to the US has all come after that moment where I invited that change. And I'm so excited to see what other adventures are going to kind of come when I get to the US and, the people I'm going to meet, because this whole thing is just beyond my wildest dreams,
Yeah, absolutely. And if I'm not mistaken, doesn't Aleister Crowley have kind of a extended or distant connection to the founding of NASA?
Yes. So he knew Jack Parsons, and basically NASA have the JPL. It's basically a rocket laboratory, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but people joke that it's called the Jack Parsons Laboratory because both Jack and Alistair spent a lot of time together doing rituals in the desert, basically, and kind of inviting entities to open portals and to give them these technologies and stuff like that. And I mean, our whole rocket program comes from it, going to the moon. That all kind of stems from those rituals in the desert. So it's really intriguing to me that through these acts of, ritual, that you can invite this, I guess, creative force to kind of guide you in some way, and that it's been so influential on our planet. You take that away, you don't have Elon Musk and his rockets and stuff like that. You don't have James Webb. We don't have all of the technologies that derive from space exploration and the social impact of looking out into the stars and wondering who we are as a result of that. It totally changes everything. So yeah, really intriguing connection there.
Yeah, and I think it's just kind of insane how Jack Parsons was friends with Aleister Crowley, but he was also friends with people like Werner von Braun, from the more physical sciences point of view. And Werner von Braun was insanely good at rocket propulsion as well. But there's also been people talking about how he was into the UFO secrecy part of it, like one of the founding members of it back in the 40s into the early 50s.
Yeah, absolutely. If I guess Roswell is the inciting incident there, but if something crashed and you wanted people to study these things, you're going to go to the most high profile, smartest people, smartest scientists on the planet. And at that time, it was people like Werner von Braun and Jack Parsons and all these guys. And then that all gets mixed up with, their kind of, at least for von Braun, the Nazi background and secret technologies there, wondering kind of what was going on behind closed doors in that. I was going to say party, but they're a cult.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the Nazi connection, this is going to be a little bit of a wild one. How do you think Nazi connection leads into, through like Project Paperclip and whatnot? How does that lead into Tom DeLonge and To the Stars and books like Secret Machines?
Yeah, great question. That for anyone that hasn't read Secret Machines, I highly recommend you go read it because it's tantalizing in its details, and I'd love to sit with Tom one day and kind of go, so can we go through the book and you tell me what's true and what's fiction, you know? But the book mentions Paperclip, as you rightly pointed out, where the US invited over a bunch of Nazis, because at the time, you know, it was either Russia gets this expertise or America does, and you're kind of between a rock and a hard place. So bringing them over and putting them to work in your programs makes a lot of sense. But the general gist of the story seems to be that the people that they brought over kind of kept in touch and kept working behind closed doors on these secret things. That has eventually culminated in, I guess, what people would call like a breakaway civilization with technologies very different to ours, and a way of life that's different to ours. I really love Peter Levender's work as well. He wrote, with Secret Machines, there's kind of two versions. There's the nonfiction and the fiction. And the difference is, you know, the one is called Chasing Shadows and A Fire Within. They're the two books that are out. They're written by A.J. Hartley. And they're kind of more like Dan Brown airport reads. So if you want, you know, if you're interested in UFOs and you want something like really light to read that you'll get through quickly and is really entertaining, go for those ones. But once you've read those, if you really want to dive into kind of the nitty gritty of stuff like Paperclip and the Nazi occult connection and consciousness and stuff like that, then the other series, God's Man and War by Peter Levender, is kind of where you want to go. A really dry read, but really, really thorough and detailed. And he touches as well on Parsons and Von Braun and stuff like that. And yeah, I don't think
it's this for anybody wondering.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's the one. I don't think there's a part really of the UFO subject in the modern day that isn't touched by that side of things, you know, the Nazism. Because, you know, you look at the Tom DeLonge and the government stuff and it's kind of all there. But also, if you go to the people calling that a psyop and you're kind of in the camp of like Stephen Greer and people like that, they all talk about Von Braun's kind of prediction for what's called Project Bluebeam, where the government was supposed to be like fake an alien invasion to gain control over the populace. And that came from someone called Carol Rosen, who said she heard it from Werner von Braun. And the weird thing about that is, you know, these people kind of push that, but there's a really strange aspect to it where Carol said that she received this from Von Braun when he was on his deathbed through mind-to-mind telepathy from like hundreds of miles away. And that always gets left out when Stephen Greer is kind of talking about this stuff because it's very woo. But when we're now looking at stuff with Jacob Barber like psionics and you know, telepathic communication and stuff like that, it's you can't shy away from it. You know, it's like, well, yeah, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the people that I've talked to, like Shane Frakes or Old Vet Symposium, who are really into the woo, say that it is such a critical part of the phenomenon overall that it should have been included from the beginning, regardless. You know, I think it should have, regardless whether that would have worsened the stigma in the beginning, because, you know, it took so long to break through the stigma. And we're still working on it day to day. But if it would have been thoroughly investigated back in like Project Blue Book times, from, you know, the consciousness and the nuts and bolts side of it, then I'm sure that, you know, people like J. Allen Hynek would have, you know, changed their tune a lot earlier on once they realized how much it was more than just nuts and bolts.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things I love doing is going back to, you know, books people writing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s before all of this like modern noise happened, because it's so hard to find, you know, good sources on social media and just the internet these days. That there's kind of something a little more pure about that stuff. And I really love John Keel for diving into the woo stuff, because in his books, and if someone hasn't read them, I'd recommend starting with the Mothman Prophecies, because it's kind of like the story of him investigating Point Pleasant as the whole Mothman sightings thing went on. There's so much weirdness in that, and he never really kind of tries to put an explanation on it or grasps it. It just is what it is, and for example, there's one portion of it where he leaves town while he's investigating all these UFO sightings and cryptid sightings and stuff. And he randomly just picks a hotel that night and pulls over into it and gets inside. And there are messages waiting for him from people that knew he was going to be there. And there was also in the book, he goes to visit his hometown, and people in his hometown tell him that there have been these mysterious strangers saying that he was going to visit his hometown for weeks, and they've been expecting him. So his friends back home aren't surprised, but he literally decided the day before to go visit his hometown. So there's this weird kind of timey-wimey strangeness to the whole thing. And he's really not afraid to get into that overlap between all these different phenomena. And he builds out this, I guess, an informant network, you would call it, where he speaks to, mediums who pass messages to him from the other side. The mediums say they speak to dead people, but there's also UFO experiences he talks to that say they get phone calls with, metallic voices on the other side that pass messages to him as well. And throughout the book, he finds that these messages just kind of all line up. They're all saying the same thing. And so when you kind of get to the end of the book, you'll kind of be like, okay, so this is all this weirdness is one and the same. It's all related to these nuts and bolts craft in the sky. And so the woo is very much a part of this whole subject. And people have been grappling with it for a long time. And I think the reason it hasn't come into the public conversation yet is because it's difficult to get your head around. It sounds like magic, and people are just really uncomfortable. And I can understand, the baby steps. If we can get people to accept this weird craft in the sky, that's a first step. And then the next step would be kind of going on to some of the stranger aspects. But as I think it's Hal Puthoff says, that when they study UFOs and they kind of think about the technology that would enable them to, do these right angle turns at hypersonic speeds and disappear on a dime and be low observability and so on and so forth, that a consequence of these technologies is that you would kind of get things like time travel, and you would get things like being able to pass messages telepathically through quantum entanglement and things like that. So I think it's all really wrapped up in one thing. And it's possible that, now we've got people building quantum computers and kind of really understanding a lot better than they did 100 years ago anything quantum, to the point where, it's in Marvel movies now. It's kind of commonplace. If you just say quantum to someone, they're like, oh yeah, they might not know what it means, but it's a common, people are familiar with the ideas of, quantum wormholes, communication, teleportation, these kinds of things in ways that aren't so esoteric these days. And so I wonder if the reason that this is kind of being pushed out now is because we're kind of grappling with all of the different parts of it. And that even goes as far as, they're doing medical trials all over the world with, things like psilocybin, MDMA, and starting to ask the question, what is consciousness? And that's a really big part of this kind of UFO equation as well. If there are craft that we control through using our minds, and that sounds crazy, but again, you've got Neuralink and you've got other technologies where people can just look at the screen and it'll select things on screen and so on and so forth. I think all of these things are kind of coalescing into showing that the public are kind of able to understand all parts of this, including the weirdness to a certain degree, to the point where if, say, the president was to kind of stand on a podium and say, okay, we're all telepathic and, all of this weirdness is true and UFOs are here, and people without meat bodies are real and, you know, they're all around you all the time, I think there would be less panic. There would almost be like a collective shrug about it, you know, we're essentially like lobsters in boiling water. We're just like, yeah, but I got stuff to do. You know, I got work tomorrow. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, like Richard Dolan and Bryce Zabel, you know, said in like AD after disclosure, you know, the first day after disclosure, you still have to go to work. You know,
Yep.
you still have to go to the store and buy your groceries. So it's not so much a world-changing event as it is a overall paradigm shift
Yeah.
where you know, just the way the things you do aren't going to change, but the way you do things probably will.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd add to that the way you think about the world around you will probably change as well.
Yeah, and it's just I speaking to people like Stephen Bassett, you know, I know he is hyper optimistic over where disclosure is going to be going this year. Where do you put yourself on the scale from, you know, Stephen Bassett to Mick West on where you
I like
think
that scale. I want a t-shirt with that
yeah, you're welcome to.
on.
But where would you put yourself on the optimism scale for disclosure in the next, say, 3 years?
I would put myself probably in the middle between those two. Like I like to think of myself as a UAP centrist or UFO centrist, where you know I'm not a full on believer because I think we're past belief. We're on to, you know, I want to know, not I want to believe anymore. But at the same time, I know from personal experience there's weird stuff out there that needs to be investigated, and it might not all be the same thing, but there's new science there and it could help us in so many different ways that it's crazy to just ignore it and sweep it under the carpet. You know, it could solve energy woes, medical crisis, you know, all sorts of things. um so I think there's going to be a push to kind of bring out aspects of this one at a time, so it's not too overwhelming. I think it was it Lou that said, you know, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But at the same time, if you just shove a hose down its throat and just run the water to make it drink, you're going to kill the horse as well. You know, you got to let it kind of drink at its own speed. Um, so I think over the next few years, we'll probably see more baby steps, little bits of legislation, more groups being set up, like the Sol Foundation. I'm seeing a lot more kind of seasoned scientists come into this and take it seriously now and start researching. And I'm almost to a point where I don't necessarily think it's going to be, I was going to say our generation, but I don't know how old you are, but my generation, you know, I'm 40 this year. I don't think it's going to be my generation that cracks this. I think it's going to be the younger generation who grew up with it as very matter of fact and without the stigma, who aren't afraid to kind of dive into the strangeness and the weird ideas and to kind of push the boundaries in that way. I think it might be, you know, 50, 60, 100 years before we kind of fully get a grasp of what this kind of stuff is, to the point where we can use that stuff too. But yeah, I would be confident saying that over the next 3 years, we're just going to get more breadcrumbs that kind of add to this loaf that is clearly there, um, just to act as an on ramp for more and more people. I don't think this ketchup is going back in the bottle anymore. You know, it's out.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And that's, you know, based on someone who was, you know, all similar to you. I was interested in the topic from a early age. You know, there was a period where I kind of stepped back from it because nothing seemed to be happening. And then, you know, December 2017 hits and everything changed.
Sure.
And, you know, if you take you know, a snapshot every 6 months since then, it almost seems as though there's been a rapid acceleration similar to Moore's law with the amount of information that the UAP topic has.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, and like nice nod to Moore's law as well. Like I think it's spot on, and part of me wonders if, because we've had these moments throughout the past, I guess 70, 80 years, probably longer now, since things like Roswell happened and the DC overflights happened in 52 and stuff like that. We've had these moments where it felt like the press were kind of trying to do something, or someone was trying to get some truth out there, and it just never took. So part of me wonders if the goal was to kind of, put like bait in the water and just see if the public takes to it. And I feel like the public have taken to it this time. And we've gone from an article that was just about, that New York Times article was just about spending 22 million on ATIP, and it didn't really get into the whole what was the quote from Jim Semivan, that he says it like buried the lead, that there's an entity living on this planet with us and we don't know what it is. That's what the article should have been, but instead they went with a bunny angle. And now here we are all debating whether Skywatcher and Jake Barber and the psionic assets can summon craft. And they're aiming to kind of prove or disprove it within this year, by the end of 2025. So it's a finite thing that they're doing. And they seem pretty confident that they can do it. Whether they can demonstrate it or not, I don't know. It remains to be seen. But it certainly shows how the conversation has changed from what it was like in the 90s to what it started as in 2017 with those 3 grainy videos, to now where we're talking about summoning things with your mind.
Yeah, and I think one thing that a lot of people seem to be dismissing nowadays would be more official footage from the government. A lot of the people that I talk to throughout the week say something along the lines of, well, at this point, there's technologies so far, everything that they put out from now on is probably just going to be AI or fake or, something like that. But do you think that genuine footage is still a good medium to help introduce more people to the topic?
I do, as long as the genuine footage has, a chain of custody. Those 3 videos stand up. The Tic Tac, Gimbal, and Go Fast. They stand up as 3 examples that made waves, not because they're just interesting videos that people put out there, but it's because there's testimony behind them. Because the DoD confirmed that they were unknowns, and there's just an authority to them that a video that, say, like I film and post online wouldn't have. They're a dime a dozen. Loads of people kind of post videos of lights online, but if we got, say, trying to think of some of the videos that have kind of been teased, like we've been told that there's some like really close up high def footage, that if the government released that and said we don't know what it is, and you also had statements from other countries that kind of said, yeah, we don't know what that is, it's not us, I think that would build a lot of public pressure and interest in this. So yeah, even though with AI has kind of mucked up the whole video and picture thing, I think the chain of custody is more important than ever. And that's why you'll see, when I see things online and I post on my social media, I go really hard on that angle, because it's easy to find a video because of AI, but it's hard to get people behind it and to get the details of, we've all got apps on our phones now, like flight radar check-in and astronomy apps and things like that, where we can get rid of a lot of the prosaic possibilities. So yeah, I think video will still have an impact as long as there's a really strong chain of custody behind it.
Absolutely. And what do you think that the general populace should be doing to help push for more of that, good chain of custody imagery to come out?
I think it's about talking to representatives and making sure they're informed, because you talk to people about UFO stuff and they still think of little green men instead of kind of is our airspace secure or our skies secure, and kind of making sure that everyone's safe. And as long as you can kind of get that angle across to them, everyone from Tim Burchett to AOC have jumped on board kind of discussing that angle. Same with things like government overspend and making sure where money where money is going, because that's I think it was, what was the last check, that there was like over $1 trillion that the Pentagon had spent that wasn't able to be accounted for in the last audit, and they've never passed an audit, which is crazy. And that's money that could be going towards people's schools and creating jobs and shoring up the economy and just creating a better life for everybody. So I think that's the way to kind of hold people to account. But as well as that, find organizations like Sol, talk to people in your everyday life, and on that, I would say don't go too hard with telling them things. Ask them things. I used to have a bar job, and whenever I have an alert set on my phone to show when the International Space Station is going over, and whenever I got the alert, I would just put all my stuff down and I'd be like, okay, who wants to come outside and see something cool? And I'd easily get like 10, 15 people outside with me watching the International Space Station go over, and it's really bright and it's really fast. And pretty much every single time people would be like, so you believe in aliens? Like, just amongst themselves. And I was kind of there to, I guess, facilitate the discussion, but I always found it really fascinating just listening to people talking amongst themselves about this, because most people think there's something out there. The only thing people are debating is whether they're visiting us, and they haven't heard these ideas of, the Silurian hypothesis, or things being under the ocean, or any of these other possibilities than just ET visiting from another planet. And so you end up having some really good, productive conversations. And I think that's the way you kind of change the trajectory of things, is to just talk to people like human beings about their beliefs about this stuff.
Yeah. And I think generating curiosity is one of the most important things you can do to help people learn more about anything, not just UFOs, but I mean, whether it's, quantum physics or the best way to make a good sourdough bread.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah.
So a completely different topic here, but how did you go from, just being on That UFO podcast to Ancient Aliens? Like, how did that happen?
So that was pretty much from going from someone that sits recording podcasts to getting out there and doing the investigations in Colombia. And when I did that, there was just a whole load of interest from people kind of who, people want to feature folk in documentaries and stuff like that have firsthand experience with this stuff. And there are loads of mysteries all over the world, just like the one we found in Colombia. The Brown Mountain Lights in North Carolina is another incredible one. And when I got to visit that, it blew my mind to see they had like a plaque on the lookout point. And there were loads of us at the lookout point, just loads of strangers kind of sat with deck chairs to see the lights. And we saw them, and it was incredible to film them. But on this plaque, it just said that basically science tried and they couldn't figure it out, so they stopped. And so there's an opportunity right there in the USA to kind of go figure out a genuine scientific mystery that could lead to all sorts of different things. So I think going out and doing boots on the ground work and properly trying to contribute to UFO research was the thing that kind of caused people like, the producers at Ancient Aliens to reach out to me. And also credit to Jeremy Corbell, who he initially kind of said to them, oh, you might want to look at this guy. Like, he's out doing work, like boots on the ground work to try and investigate these mysteries. And off the back of that, they got in touch with me. And then, I think I filmed with them like 4 or 5 times now, and they've been great. And contrary to popular belief, I swear your cat's teleporting. Like, it goes from one side to the other side. It's just like,
yeah, he's fast as fuck, boy.
Contrary to popular belief, that the guys that make Ancient Aliens, they're not at all like full-on believers of everything they hear about UFO stuff. And one of the first things they said to me was that they really appreciated how grounded I was in my approach to it. So when I was kind of debating like, oh, do I want to go on Ancient Aliens with the reputation that it has, I was like, well, If I don't, they're just going to get someone else that I'm going to complain about when I watch it, versus me kind of going, all right, yeah, sure. Like, why not? I like to think that I do my research and due diligence. So if you're giving me this platform to talk to a load of people sensibly about this, like, yeah, I'm going to take the opportunity. Of course I am.
Yeah, and I've seen a couple of your appearances. I don't keep up too much on Ancient Aliens, but I know growing up it was one of the things that helped generate the most curiosity when it comes to our ancient history and how it relates to what we learn. Because I know that there's a lot of history that has kind of been lost over the years. I mean, humanity has only been recording history for 6 to 7,000 years. And, first humans showed up approximately 130,000 years ago. And I understand it would have taken a long time for civilization to occur, but what happened while civilization was occurring,
Yeah,
during the
absolutely.
process?
It's
And
fascinating to think about. When I was talking to Lee Berger about the Homo naledi stuff, we were saying, like, because obviously I have my UFO t-shirt on, so I was talking to a full-on field research and scientist about it whilst wearing a UFO shirt, and I was just like, oh my god, is he going to judge me? And he didn't at all. We started talking about human precursors and stuff like that, and he joked. He said, yeah, the truth is that we've never been alone, but we just killed the rest of them. And I was like,
yeah,
yeah, that's a harrowing way to put it, isn't it? Like, we're the last human survivors.
yeah, I would love to be able to go back and, just take a little piece from all of our, non-human ancestors and bring them into the modern day and see if, I'm sure nowadays we're a lot more peaceful than we were back then. We're not fighting so hard for survival. I mean, we're nearly 9 billion people on this planet now.
Yeah.
And if we were to bring, some of our non-human ancestors into the modern age, I have a feeling they would adapt better to it than we would.
Possibly. Like, there's going to be things where they would struggle for food, for example. If we're talking hunter gatherers, like food, medicine, stuff like that, that stuff's on tap, basically. I know there's still struggles with it in a lot of ways, but struggles that they never would have even imagined would be struggles. Just the idea that you can go into a place down the road that's just a room just full of food and just grab it, like, and you don't have to hunt for it, or go out, and it like, that would be such a paradigm shift for them that they would appreciate. And I think it's things like that in the modern day that we all kind of take for granted a little bit. But the problems we have, like war in the Middle East at the moment, and mutually assured destruction through nuclear weapons, these are things that those people never would have even dreamed would be a problem. So it would be interesting to bring them forward and just see what they think of them, because who knows, maybe they would wax poetic and convince us all to just calm down on those fronts.
Yeah, I could only hope that they would get us to calm down worldwide. I mean, there's so much, conflict around the world that has been going on for millennia. And I think that solving solving the conflict through transparency, such as, in the UAP topic, bring us all together on a common page so that we can understand what we need to do as a human society, not just countries. But
Yeah.
it's we need a unifying. I mean, it's already in use, but we need a unifying field. Um, a theory for a unified field of humanity, not just of physics or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I find it bonkers to think about, just because this the idea of coming up with a unified humanity, a mutually assured survival, I guess, would be so alien to someone from hundreds of years ago. Like if you take the Maya, for example, at that time you had everything going on in Spain, and there were other civilizations going on at the same time. That the Romans were kind of doing their thing, and the Greeks and stuff like that, and they didn't know about each other. They couldn't even imagine each other, so they would never have imagined something like you just described. So it's kind of like modern problems and modern solutions, right? And it would be amazing to get someone now to kind of, literally spreadsheet all the resources we have planet wide and kind of divvy them out to people based on their needs. And I think it's clear we have enough. It's just the impetus to do something like that. And without the problems we face, no one would ask questions that led to a solution like that. So, it's that, like we were saying with Chernobyl, from that destruction, we get this marvelous creation. And I think they go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at it, and I mean I think I agree with you on that.
Yeah, I would love someone to do it. I don't know who. I guess it should be me because I pitched it, put my money where my mouth is, but I wouldn't know how to start.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? How do you start it?
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, so I want to ask, have you had any genuine UFO sightings yourself?
Yes. Like, too many to count, but there's one that stands out when anyone asks me that question. And this happened during COVID, where I would pretty much every night I would get my kind of sun lounger and I'd set it up in the garden and just lay on it, have some tea, put music on my headphones, and just watch the sky for like hours and hours every night, a solid 7-8 hours every night. And I saw, when you watch the sky, you kind of what's there. So I saw a light that I thought was the International Space Station coming over the horizon, and I was just like watching it, because I like to imagine them watching us. And it's really interesting that we have something like that up there. And so this light comes up until about the apex of the sky, and it stops. Like, and it took me a few seconds to realize that it stopped, and I was just like, wait, is it just a trick of the eye? And I'm getting up and I'm moving around the garden and looking at it, and I'm like, no, that's stopped. Interesting. And then as soon as I kind of admitted to myself that it stopped, it started doing this like motion. So it carried on down the the other side toward the horizon, and it was wafting like a leaf falling on the wind, basically, if you can imagine that. And so it's just this bright light making that motion, really early in the morning, so no one else is awake. I doubt anyone else saw it. I've never met anyone who also saw it. And then as it reaches the horizon and is just about to disappear, like over the roof of my house, it stops on a dime again, and then goes from in front of me to the horizon behind me in maybe like less than a second. It was just gone. So, up until the point where it stopped, I was just like, International Space Station. And then from that point on, it broke my brain.
Yeah, and when you witnessed that, was there any after effects that you noticed? Did you have any like weird dreams or ideas that you wouldn't have previously had, or any weird smells or anything like that? Or was it just
Nope.
I saw it?
So no smells. I don't remember any vivid dreams, but I did stay up just, for a solid week. Like, I couldn't think about anything else. Like, I drew what I saw. I was taking pictures to kind of try and capture it and send it to Lou and kind of go like, this is what I just experienced. Like, what the hell? And as far as I could get with it was pretty much like, yeah, that's a weird thing. Like we don't make anything that drifts like a leaf on the wind in the sky. And at that point, when I kind of put out that experience on my socials, I had a lot of people sending me other UFO reports where that exact thing, a leaf on the wind motion, or a falling leaf motion, was described by other witnesses. And so that's what I hold as like my gold standard UFO sighting, where I was just like, yeah, we don't have planes that just move that way, or like the International Space Station just move that way. And I know there's an effect, I forget what it's called, but someone sent a link to me where when you're looking at a light in the sky that's moving, your eyes kind of drift very slightly. So it can look like something zigzagging when it's not. But this was like, it was such a dramatic swing. You know, I put my two fingers up to the sky and it was easily clearing the sides of my two fingers as I kind of held them out. So they were dramatic swings. It wasn't just like slight movements in my eyes, you know?
Yeah, that's insane. I mean, I've had a couple of sightings similar to that. But I'm also blessed to be in, the top UFO hotspot in the United States, which is Washington State. Going back to 1947, the Maury Island incident, and
Yeah.
Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier, and that's continued all the way up until the modern day. There's even reports of crash retrievals here in Washington, which I'm planning on looking into more very soon. But it's, I think, sharing your sighting, or what you felt about your sighting, no matter whether it's something super impressive like a fully structured craft that landed in the cornfield out in your back acreage, or just the lights in the sky. It's sharing your story is always important.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
what do you think would be the best way for people who have experienced this but have always hesitated to talk about it? What would you recommend for people like that to get their story out?
I would say be courageous. You know, I completely understand that people attack you when you share this stuff, but so many people that see this stuff aren't UFO people. You know, they're just people that have day jobs and, look after their kids, focused on, raising their families, that kind of stuff. And then they just have like this crazy anomalous thing that comes into their life for a moment and then leaves and just, occupies their brain for the rest of their lives, and they don't know how to deal with it. So yeah, I would say be courageous. Just talk about it with people. Like when I talk about mine, and I'm in a fortunate position because people know me from that UFO podcast. So when people talk to me, they share their sightings all the time, and I'm real blessed in that way. And it's really nice to kind of be a channel that people can kind of open up to, from something traumatic that they haven't been able to share. But yeah, also I would emphasize, be courageous, talk about it in any way that you can with people. Try not to let it obsess you so that you start wearing tinfoil hats and that kind of stuff. Just talk about it in a very matter of fact way. I saw this weird thing, and but also if you're someone that really deeply struggles with this on a kind of mental health level and it's affected you, there are organizations out there that can help. There's a UAP medical coalition that's kind of around on social media. There's the Experiencer group as well, run by Jay King from New York, that kind of invites people in. But there are also really great psychologists. Like there's one here in South Wales that I'm fortunate enough to know, Dr. Daniel Stubbings, who's doing an experiencer study. And he's not looking to tell you whether it happened or whether it didn't. He's just looking to let you tell your story and to study it and to study the effects on you through, just doing a questionnaire. And he's running one now, and I can send you the link if you want, so you can pop that in your description. And you can contribute to things like that. And hopefully that kind of helps people transmute it from something that makes them feel like they want to go into their shell to something that they feel can really impact others and kind of contribute to changing the world.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, that how there is resources for people who are struggling with the phenomenon, like the UAP Medical Center, or places like what Jay King is doing with his experiencer support groups. So I I genuinely suggest that people go out and look into those, because there's, you know, a, a key part of the population has seen these and doesn't know how to deal with the things that they've seen. And it's okay to be vulnerable about this topic. Too often I hear people saying, well, I don't want to talk about what I saw because, people are just going to make fun of me. That might have been true 10 years ago, but things have changed. And now there's more people that are willing to listen and hear what you have to say, as opposed to just listen to what you have to say. That it's okay to share your experience and, be vulnerable about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I really hope more people do come forward, because I'm a firm believer in every experience matters. I feel like every experience is a puzzle piece to figuring this out. So throw your puzzle piece in. Like, let's put this puzzle together.
Yeah, it's going to turn out to be something incredible, like a 3D R2D2 puzzle.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so I think we're getting close to the end here. So I have a question or two that I try to ask everybody. First question, what is your favorite food or meal?
Oh, so my favorite food would be a Mexican dish, tostadas, and it's basically like a fried taco that's flat, and then on that you kind of you put your bean sauce and your fresh vegetables kind of up there, and you can add your protein like chicken or beef or whatever you like, and some cheese on top. It's really light, really refreshing, really healthy. I couldn't get enough of it when I was in Mexico, and I long for more of it. So yeah. Or if I wasn't allowed that, I'd say just, a good all American cheeseburger.
Oh, yeah, the two best choices right there. The second question is, what is your guilty pleasure dessert?
Ooh. So I take issue with the question in one way, because I don't believe in guilty pleasures. I think everybody should embrace their pleasures and not feel guilty about them. Let your flag fly. But I would say it's sticky toffee pudding. And I know you guys don't really have that in the US. It's more of a UK thing. When my fiance came over, I got it for her, and we sat in we had a really nice bath and just ate dessert. It was incredible. But it's basically like a sponge with toffee sauce on it. And it's meant to be like heated up and warm. And it should be a thing in the US, because you guys would love it. You love your sweet treats. So maybe I can bring it over when I come over.
Well, I think if you were to start a chain restaurant of just the sticky toffee pudding, you would be so rich you could solve the UFO topic within a year. I mean, America loves its sugar. I mean, it's breakfast time, so I have my Dr. Pepper.
Nice. But, yeah, you guys would truly love sticky toffee pudding.
Yes. So, if anyone would like to follow you or get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so?
Yeah, so on social media, you can find me at The Signal. It's basically The Signal, but with a Z instead of an S, because someone else had it. Then my email address, you can get me at thesignal@protonmail.com. But as well as that, I'm going to be launching my own show soon, which you can find at tobehumanshow.com. So feel free to reach out there or any of those, and I'll get back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you coming on, my man. And I think we had an awesome conversation, and I hope in the future to have you back on as long as you're willing, and talk more about UFOs and kind of where we're going, and the future of the topic, or even the past.
Of course, it would be my pleasure to come back on, and thank you for having me. And it's been an awesome conversation. So let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
You too, man.
secrets on this lonely road. Street lights flicker, shadows creep. The air is humming, too loud to sleep. Time bends slow, horizons fold. What's out there can't be controlled. Beaming down with the cosmic glow. They're here tonight, but they won't let us know. Signals buzzing through the midnight air. Aliens watching, but they don't declare.
Right now.
Magic coming through the night because it's still enough light in the sky.
Their craft floats like a restless dream. Metallic wings near the moon's pale gleam. Questions rise, no answers fall. Do they guide or just watch it all? Astral murmurs in the twilight wind. Are they foes or kin we've pinned? Through telescopes we yearn to see a universe that's no longer mystery.
Look, it's there, pulsing. Ah, it's two lights. One there and then the other pulse here. Look.
The cosmic glow. They're here tonight, but they won't let us know. Signals
Look.
buzzing through the midnight sky. Unknown beings under alien guise.
So we continue record.
I don't know if we should tell what it is crazy.
So I'm gonna put, because of the battery, put the other battery in
It's
charge.
on charge.
Okay. So I'm gonna put, I've stopped recording.